Great, let's get started. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us for the user identity part one. I appreciate it's a very hot summer, it's a beautiful day, so I really appreciate you all taking the time to be with us today. We're hosting this session because user identity is a key area of focus for us at IAB UK this year, given that the changes in this area and the pertinence of this topic is something that is of significant importance to a number of our members kind of from across the industry. Before we get started, if we can move on to the next slide. I just wanted to inform you all of, or direct you all to our user identity hub, part of our website. So there is, obviously today we're running this event and we've got part two on Tuesday. However, there is a whole host of work that we're doing in the area of user identity. So we'd like to direct you to this area of our website, so iabuk.com/user-identity to find out more about all the different work that we have going on in this area, and also to welcome you all to get involved in some of that work and projects that we are running. So you can find out all the details on the dedicated hub on our website. Before we get started with this webinar today, if we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to say a big thank you to our sponsor, OneTrust. So OneTrust offer technology that powers privacy, security and trust programs that interact directly with consumers. We're going to be hearing from OneTrust later today, but given their relationship with consumers and their involvement in regulatory work, they are so pertinent to this conversation. So really delighted to have them here speaking for us today, and also thank them for sponsoring this event and allowing us to bring you all. In terms of questions, so if you have a look at your screen, depending on the layout, it's either above or below or to the side, depending on your settings. However, there should be a button for you to be able to click on Q&A, and so please, if you do have any questions along the way, please do feed them into that box and our speakers can get back to you. I believe we are hosting a Q&A session towards the end of the event, so you can ask all the speakers, but if there's anything that you'd like to ask as we go along, please do so using the box available there. If we move on to the next slide, I also wanted to use this moment with you all here today to just inform you all of, obviously we have events such as this one that we run kind of throughout the week and throughout the month. There are also a number of other training events that are run by Programmatic Advisory, who we'll be hearing from a bit later, and there's kind of a number of great training courses that you can take, so please do check out the events and training section of our website to find out what's on and to register for any of those. In terms of agenda today, so today's event is all about user identity, which is such a broad topic. And here today we'll be hearing from our members from across the industry talking about various solutions that they have within identity, or how their company type or their product offering works in kind of the space of identity. So we'll be hearing from, on topics like how regulatory issues feed into the topic of identity, universal identity solutions, in-app companies, contextual targeting solutions, and many others. As a reminder, this is part one of a two-day event, next part two being on Tuesday, so we can go through the full agenda. We'll first be hearing from Programmatic Advisory, doing an introduction, moving on to talking about the regulatory topics happening in the space, hearing from Universal Identity Solutions. I think after that we have, if we go to the next slide, I believe it's a permutive, talking about the power of first-party data, talking about how contextual targeting feeds into this conversation, and then rounding up talking about how in-app feeds into this conversation too. So if we move on to the next slide, before we get started, I think it's just loading. So before we get started, I just wanted to do a quick poll of everyone that is here today, just to get kind of an idea of who we have in the room today. So a poll should have appeared on your screen now, and if you wouldn't mind just completing it to let us know what part of the industry you are from. So you should just be able to select one of the buttons and press submit, and we'll give it a couple of seconds and then we will show the answers. We'll just give it a minute or so. Great, maybe if we pull up the results. Great, lots of you from other. If you comment within the Q&A section, we'd love to hear where you're from, but quite a mix otherwise from brand, agency, DSP, and kind of the full range of the supply chain. So great to have you all here. With that, I believe I'm handing over to our first speaker, who is Danielle, a senior programmatic consultant at the Programmatic Advisory, who is going to kind of start off by introducing the problem or the topic of identity and giving us an overview of some of the topics and how they relate to this subject, which I think will kind of put us in a good way to approach and understand some of the sessions that will follow. So Danielle, I'll hand over to you. Thanks.
Perfect, thanks Tina. Hopefully you can all see my screen okay and hear me okay. So as Tina said, I'm just sort of covering off the introduction to the problem, so sort of setting the scene for the rest of the content for this afternoon around user identity. So just a quick intro for starters. My name is Danny Stewart and I work for the Programmatic Advisory. So we're an impartial programmatic consultancy and we work with companies to really finesse their programmatic strategy. So identity is definitely something that we're having more and more conversations about, just as the issues get a bit more real for brands and they really start to look to quantify the impact this is going to have for them. So we're going to be covering off an introduction into the identity challenges that are being faced by advertisers, starting with looking at what identity means in marketing, how this is changing, the impact of this change, and then possible solutions. So first, an introduction. So being able to sort of identify users really powers that existing one-to-one nature that we've become so used to within digital advertising. So whether this is being used for targeting, so retargeting or behavioral targeting, and sort of the personalization that comes off the back of that, or whether it's used for measurement, so recording a user's interactions for things like attribution and conversion tracking. And we even use it for things like frequency capping, so controlling the amount of exposures a user has to any ad. So by being able to identify that user, we've got the ability to then cap and control that. So these three things mixed together and the ability to really pinpoint your users, where they are and what they're doing, really feed into that granular one-to-one approach that we've got for digital advertising currently. So identifying users, it does currently largely hinge on the use of cookies and device IDs. So cookies, these are a browser-based identification method. So it's a text file that's being dropped by a server that sits in the browser and can be read later. So that's used in a web environment, regardless of whether that's desktop web or that's mobile web. And then we've got device IDs. So these are used in an app environment and it's a unique identifier for an individual smartphone or tablet. So it's important to note with cookies that there are two different types at play here. So we've got first-party cookies and third-party cookies. So first-party cookies, this type of cookie is created by the domain that the user has directly visited. So these types of cookies, they're largely considered good cookies because they tend to really help keep that user experience really slick. So they remember things like your language preference, so you don't have to keep setting it each time you go on site. They remember things like you've added to your basket so they don't drop off. And even simple things like just keeping you consistently logged in on the website. So an example here might be that you visit britishairways.com and it remembers the previous routes that you've researched or maybe the previous trips that you've been on, and it uses this to really tailor the suggested routes that it's surfacing to you on their site. And then we have third-party cookies. So these are cookies that are set by a website other than the one that you're currently on. So they're used for cross-site tracking, retargeting, and ad serving purposes. So we visit example.com and the cookie that's being dropped is from an external source. So it's from Google for tracking purposes. So because google.com isn't the domain that the user is actually visiting, it's then classed as a third party. And these third-party cookies, these are really the ones being most affected by the changes that are taking place. and we'll go into a bit more depth on that in the following content. So what's changing, what's been shifting, what's been happening? So the landscape's really shifted in a few ways. So there's been updated regulation, which I'm sure everyone's aware of, but there's also this increase in consumer awareness and general concerns over data privacy. And then there's also the ways that technology is responding to both these regulatory and these societal shifts and adapting their ways of working as a result of this. So I'll break down each of these key changes in the following slides, but just to sort of summarize, Apple's ITP update, these have consistently reduced the advertisers' ability to drop third-party cookies in Safari browsers. So they took a really strong stance on this from the offset back in 2017. And then we can see there's been more iterations since throughout 2018 and 2019. We also had the implementation of GDPR in May 2018. So this had a lot of consequences for all parties that were handling data. So for marketers, digital data capture was, suddenly restricted, which resulted in shrinking third-party cookie pools. And we saw some major players really reduce how much data they were willing to share, which restricted what we were able to do with some attribution methodologies that we were used to. We've also got the CCPA. This came into effect in January, so the California Consumer Privacy Act. And even though it does only currently affect residents of California, this legislation probably is a precursor for something that's going to be adopted USA-wide, possibly in the future. And we are seeing an uptake of similar laws, looking to be passed in other far-reaching countries as well. Also in January 2020, we had the Chrome announcement. So Chrome finally announced that they were deciding to phase out third-party cookies by 2022. Finally, we've got e-privacy as well. So e-privacy regulations are being continually developed and they're expected to be released at some point in this year. But e-privacy really covers all communications over digital mediums, and it's going to supersede GDPR. So we might see some further legislation here that's going to sort of shake things up. So digging into GDPR slightly, so GDPR set out how personal data could be lawfully processed, and actually under these guidelines, cookies met the definition of personal data. And under those 6 lawful bases for collecting personal data, when collecting it for marketing and analytics purposes, a lot of companies, they did initially rely on legitimate interest, but the ICO came forward and essentially said the scenarios where this would actually be applicable and would be the correct grounds for collecting this data are so limited, and that they'd actually not seen anywhere where it was the compliant use of legitimate interest. So really, consent is the only legal basis here. So proper GDPR compliance for marketing and analytics purposes, it requires companies to collect their voluntary and explicit consent from users before they can actually think about saving cookies to their devices and collecting any personal data like email addresses. So this has naturally affected cookie pools because everyone needs to actively consent, which of course not everyone does. And then moving on now to the browser changes. So there's been an increase in restricting third-party cookies. So starting off with Safari, as I said, they took a stance on this back in 2017, and Apple can afford to really position themselves with a privacy focus because their revenue doesn't depend on advertising. So they can really take a strong stance here. So ITP, this stands for Intelligent Tracking Prevention. And it's a feature that's bundled in with Safari to try and limit tracking across websites. And it's had a couple of iterations and it's gotten more stringent over time to combat the workarounds that people are coming up with. So the current version is 2.3, which sets out that third-party cookies are not supported at all, and first-party cookies expire after 24 hours. So even those cookies that we were saying could be useful, those expire as well after 24 hours. And then we've got Firefox. So Firefox is an open source browser and it's created by a non-profit. So they've also got got to safeguard for privacy reasons as well. So Firefox now blocks all third-party cookies, and they also make it really easy and straightforward in their settings to tick another box and also block first-party cookies. So only third-party cookies blocked by default, but very, very easy for the user to adjust it to also block first-party. And then we've got Chrome. So it was unknown what their plan was going to be for a while, just because, of course, they have a huge vested interest because so much of Google's revenue comes from advertising. But they made the announcement in January 2020 that third-party cookies will be phased out by 2022. And this is the change that's probably going to have the biggest impact on the UK, just because Chrome's got quite a large browser market share here. And they did initially take steps to make it easier for users to identify and delete those third-party cookies, but this plan is going to block them altogether. So with their privacy sandbox approach, they're hoping to create a new initiative that's going to become that new standard for running campaigns within Chrome. So it will rely on anonymized signals within that person's Chrome browser, but we're sort of still waiting for a bit more information on exactly how this is going to work. It's still a work in progress. And then really this slide is just to highlight the sort of a general increased consumer awareness about the role of cookies was reducing cookie pools further anyway. So even without these browser changes and without the regulation updates, cookies did still have other hurdles to overcome, and they weren't necessarily that silver bullet to identity anyway. So just to go through these, consumers were more aware and active in regularly deleting their cookies to protect their own privacy. So meaning that we don't have that consistent user view even when cookies are being dropped. If it's being dropped and then deleted, we're assuming that's a new person each time when actually it's the same user. We've also seen increases in ad blocking, so meaning that cookies aren't dropped on an estimated 20% of UK internet users that are using this. And we've also got the increasing popularity of incognito browsing. So research back in 2017 found that 20% of users were browsed incognito even back then. So this has been leading to new entrants in the market because it's that popular. So there's really been a lot of change that's really continually been obscuring the cookie's ability to consistently fulfill its role for identity. So what do these changes actually mean? What's it impacting? Well, we touched on this at the beginning, but really a lot of the practices that we are currently largely dependent on, they use the third-party cookie. So not absolutely everything, there are a few exceptions to the rule, but a lot of things do hinge on this. So when fewer users are going to be consenting and browsers are going to be purging cookies within each of their own timeframes, this is going to result in a smaller audience pool in order to, accurately carry out these methods that we can see on the screen. So things like frequency capping and sequential targeting, they become less accurately orchestrated because we can't consistently recognize the user like we need to. And we'll start to see fewer users in retargeting and lookalike and third-party data pools as well. So really quite a few things that have been historically heavily relied upon in digital marketing. And there's quite a lot of reliance in measurement practices as well. So ITP and that need for consent on attribution, that's going to really reduce the amount that we can see of that whole consumer journey. So in an ideal world, we want to see all the interactions that users are having with ads and then their subsequent conversions within that conversion window. But in the case of Safari, where they've reduced this ability to track down to 24 hours, well, that's only also for the ones that have actually given consent. So this ideal view is definitely becoming more obscured for tracking and attribution outside of that window. And even things like incrementality and split testing, they become more challenging because we can't, any longer accurately match a specific exposure to an action at user level. So what this practically means is that it's becoming harder to measure the impact that advertising has on a particular strategy or channel when we're using these practices. So The idea of the death of the third-party cookie, it is mainly affecting desktop. So desktop accounts for 44% of the UK's web access, where 49% of that market share is said to belong to Chrome. So we're not seeing any of these changes implemented just yet in Chrome. So up till this point, the need for adaptation hasn't seemed so pressing for a lot of UK advertisers, but Chrome's announcement has definitely kicked this into action. And I say it's only affecting desktop, but actually the reality is that all of these principles that apply to this, so the user level tracking, the privacy and control, they all apply to device IDs as well. So it's generally pretty well accepted that device IDs are going to end up going in the same direction. It's just a matter of time. So sort of to quantify the impact in a few scenarios we've got here, as we start to recognise fewer users, we're going to have a less accurate picture of measurement. So what this in turn might lead to is a misallocation of budget based on inaccurate results. And next, if we can't accurately monitor our frequency capping, well, this might then result in oversaturating our audience that we've already showed a lot of ads to, and actually wasting our media spend that way. And with less targeting options possibly becoming available, there might be a need to use broader audiences. So this would require a more generic, less accurate, creative messaging, which is definitely something that we've become used to. So we'd have to be looking at this from much more of a top line. And finally, if we're recognizing fewer users, then our retargeting pools are also going to decrease. So retargeting is currently a huge tactic which drives performance, and so this is inevitably going to have a negative effect on the campaigns that are being run, as well as publisher revenues. So what can be done about all of this? So first, it's worth recognizing that the ecosystem is unlikely to just revert back and become as one-to-one as we currently know it. There will be some adjustment to be made. So this slide is actually taken from the IAB Tech Lab, where they've summarized the levels of consumer addressability really well and what the solutions to each of these might look like. So realistically, an alternative to cookies is probably going to be a combination of a lot of these methods of addressability. And you'll be hearing more depth on a lot of these solutions throughout the afternoon from the other speakers. So just to really touch on a few of them now. So we've got authenticated. This method's relying on a login or an explicit ID. So relying on things like emails, phone numbers, and these are quite strong, persistent identifiers because they're way less likely to expire. We've got recognized addressability. So, you know, the methods of device IDs and third-party cookies, they do still exist, but we've also seen the introduction of things like DigiTrust, where the industry is trying to eliminate the excess versions of cookies with a single shared ID. So almost replicating the third-party cookie functionality, but in a more compliant way. And then we've got aggregated. So this is referring to things like Google's privacy sandbox, where the approach is being led by Google and companies that control these systems. So you've got the industry feeding into that solution and helping to shape the direction that that's going in. So that solution is going to be sitting within that particular browser in this example. Finally, anonymous. So it's in this scenario where we're not going to have visibility on tracking or measurement, and in this case what we might resort to is contextual and first-party data, using this to really make estimations and assumptions from these signals rather than using identity signifiers. So really, as I said, it's likely to be a mixture of all of these methods to really account for all the different levels of addressability that we're going to see. So right from someone fully consenting and using that logged in environment, right down to someone that's not consenting and being completely untrackable and unmeasurable. So there's definitely going to be some adjustment, seeing as we're also used to this really solid full accountability. So it's definitely something to be testing and moving forward with probably sooner rather than later. Thank you. I will pass back to you now, Tina.
Great, thank you so much, Danny. That was a fantastic introduction. I'm really glad that we started you because I think it tees us up really well because you've introduced so many of the topics that we're going to be going on to. I'm just going to use this moment to plug. I mean, Danny was obviously brilliant, and we have a number of training programs available on our website run by Programmatic Advisory on a number of topics. So please do check those out. I think we're now handing over to our next speakers who are going to be talking about something that was touched on in Danny's presentation, which is universal identity solutions. And on this topic, we're going to be hearing from James, who is from Index Exchange, and we're going to be hearing from Matthew from ID5, both of whom are going to be talking about universal identity solutions. I believe the first speaker between those two is James. So I will hand over to you.
Sorry to interrupt you. It's Alex from OneTrust next.
Sorry, I got my notes mixed up. Yes, you're right. Sorry about that. So apologies. Second speaker is Alex. So Alex is going to be speaking. So Alex is from OneTrust and is going to be speaking about how. So Danny just nicely covered how there are so many different areas or stakeholders that are affecting the area or topic of identity, and Alex is going to be focusing on how on privacy rights and how and the regulatory landscape of identity. So apologies for that confusion from my side. I will now hand over to Alex.
No worries, thank you, Tina. And thanks, Danny, as well. Done a fantastic job of introducing a few things that I'll be covering as well. So I really appreciate that intro. So the first thing I wanted to do very quickly is I believe we have a poll question for the audience that we'd like to show on the screen. Okay, so do you agree with the following statement? Privacy requirements improve user experiences. Agree, disagree, or neither? Now, the reason I asked this question is that I have my own opinion on this, and I'm fairly confident that I can guess what the overwhelming response will be from the audience, but I might be wrong. But I'm hoping that through this session, we can cover a couple of points that might inspire a little bit of hope and potentially change the perspective a touch on how we interact with user experiences from a privacy perspective. I'll just wait for a couple of seconds for everyone to finish answering that, and we can put the results up on the screen as well. Perfect. Okay. Slightly different outcome than I expected, but 36% agree that privacy requirements improve user experiences. I'm actually in that bucket. 25% neither agree nor disagree, and 39% disagree. So slightly prevailing with disagree, which I was expecting a slightly higher percentage, if I'm honest. But let's see if we can maybe convince a couple of those in the 39% to think a little differently. So my name is Alex Cash. I lead our solutions engineering team for the Preference Choice brand within the OneTrust organization. My background is in engineering and development, but I've recently studied to become a bit of a privacy expert. And I work with a number of our customers across a variety of privacy topics. I used to run implementations for multinational European brands. But I've recently moved over to this Preference Choice offering, and I focus exclusively on our work with publishers and customer-facing products that we offer. For the agenda for the day, I'm going to go through just a couple of points about why it is that we're speaking to you, why we're sponsoring this event, and then a couple of points on the regulatory landscape, building off some of Danny's points earlier. Next, I'm going to try and frame up some of the challenges that we're facing today and put them into a context, again, building off what Danny said, into challenges that our customers face and move into opportunities moving forwards to improve user experience, optimize user journeys, and help your business with regards to sort of trust and transparency. So as a business, OneTrust, we've been around for, I think, approaching 5 years now. And we've just crossed actually 5,700 customers globally across a really broad range of products. we have about 1,500 employees, and almost half are in R&D, which is you know, a big value to our customer base, is that our ability to iterate on product is sort of unmatched by our competitors today. And then we're also globally scaled. So you'll recognize my accent as being from the UK, but I'm actually calling you from my apartment in New York. I moved over here to support our work with publishers in New York City. And we have team members all over the world speaking a variety of different languages. When it comes to the preference choice offering, as we call it, we focus on products for publishers across a variety of themes. So the CMP is the one that is consuming about 14 hours a day for me, with the IAB TCF version 2 switch over that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We also support, however, with privacy rights management more broadly, cross-device consent and preference management, and first-party data capture. All of these tie into the topics that we're talking about today, and I'll try and touch on primarily a couple of these around consent and privacy rights. When it comes to the CMP market, we currently hold the #1 position with regards to market share. So IAB have been doing a market study since late 2018, and you'll see us there holding the #1 position. This is my area of specialism, is around consent products, and hence why I'm speaking to you today. But with my background in privacy, I wanted to sort of try and ground the discussion in a couple of specific use cases that we see as a challenge today, but a considerable opportunity moving forwards, particularly if we're able to leverage some of these changes to the identity approaches that we currently make use of, and some of the options that Danny touched on give us real possibility to improve user experience. As you're all familiar, there are seemingly infinite privacy laws, regulations, industry standards, and also, as Danny mentioned, this is something that is expanding. I'm going to focus today on GDPR. We're speaking to IAB UK, but be aware that there are changes globally. India, the Middle East, Brazil, countries are waking up to the requirements for privacy legislation at either from a sort of a vertical perspective, but more broadly now we're actually seeing them be across all industry at a national level. The reason for this, that we see Europe leading the charge, is that there is much broader awareness in the market today from consumers that personal data is currency, whichever way you look at it, depending on how you value that. So there is a requirement here for us to be able to demonstrate respect and transparency, and the forcing function for that is regulation. It introduces significant challenges for the sort of audiences on the line today, but opportunity, as I mentioned, as well. So the 2 points I wanted to focus in on from the GDPR, things that I'm sure you've been battling with already, but is consent, and then the right to data deletion, or more broadly, the rights of individuals to access, modify, and change their data. So the first of these is consent, and as Danny mentioned, we need consent to use cookie-based technologies, and that includes, of course, a huge number of tools that we use for measurement, targeting, and all of those different identity-based tools that we need to deliver programmatic. Consent is currently handled broadly in the industry using frameworks such as the IAB TCF, at least that's the case in Europe. So there are standards and mechanisms in place, but of course, being under GDPR, the consent needs to be an opt-in mechanism. So we need somebody to take a clear affirmative action to say, yes, is it okay to process my personal data in a specific way? There are a huge number of requirements around consent that are drivers for the current experiences that we see. So consent to be valid, needs to be opt-in, but it also needs to be informed. So we need to give the right amount of information to the user when they click accept. We need to give them the options to toggle on and off on a kind of group basis or a purpose basis, as we call it. And we need to be able to withdraw consent very easily. For the right to erasure, we need to offer this to all Europeans. And there are two ways to think about this, two scenarios. There is the kind of anonymous, as I'll call it, or partially identified, where someone's just browsing your site, but we are collecting and processing data. And then there's the known user, when, let's say, they've signed up for something like a newsletter. So you have their email address, you're emailing them content. Those two different scenarios have different requirements from a technology perspective and from a process perspective. Fairly straightforward when someone's saying, hey, I'm signed up for your newsletter, I don't want to receive that anymore, can you delete my data? Different if they want to click a button to have their data deleted in a sort of semi-anonymous scenario. One of the biggest challenges here is propagating consent to third parties, and something that may get easier over time based on how we adopt identity solutions. So I'll focus in on a couple of the challenges here and look at, moving on from that, how do we build on those challenges? How do we solve them in a meaningful way that is going to be incorporating these changes to identity, but also privacy from the design phase? So as we've heard, we're losing third-party cookies, basically. That's the short way to describe it. And the direct consequence of that from a privacy perspective is probably net positive. However, net negative when we want to think about revenue-generating activities around programmatic. It also, from a consent perspective, has that very specific disadvantage that we use third-party cookies to share consent across digital properties, across domains. And so we're losing that capability straight away. But the more impactful thing, I think, here is that the response to this is alternative solutions and a push to a first-party data strategy. And so there are so many benefits to publishers and brands around collecting and using first-party data for personalization and content delivery. So we have a future-proof strategy. We don't need those third-party data sets. We don't need third-party cookies. We are able to improve our cross-channel user experience. So when someone picks up their phone to continue reading an article, for example, that they started on their laptop, that can be consistent. We've also got the ability to capture first-party data in a sort of value exchange. Something that we're seeing increasingly in the market today from publishers is the choice provided to the reader to say either you come through my paywall and you become a subscriber and there's no ads, or you accept targeted advertising. A shift in response to privacy here, but an opportunity for brands and publishers to capture data to better understand their readers, better understand their consumers, and target content, target ads in a much more meaningful way. Fantastic. However, of course, there are drawbacks. As you move to a first-party data strategy, you become a steward of more data yourself. And inherently, this becomes more sensitive as well. As I start to combine information that I know about a user across multiple channels and devices, I start to come into contact with different types of data. On mobile, we have location data more often. We think about device IDs that are tied fixed permanently to a device, not like a temporary cookie. And with this comes more compliance hurdles. Now, we can summarize this when we think about the relationship between all of the different objectives that we're trying to achieve here and different parties within the business. So privacy, customer experience, and advertising activities are on a collision course. I'd say they've potentially already collided. And the first form of that is that publishers must have permission to deliver programmatic. And more broadly than that, we need consent for cookies, whatever they are. And currently, this has a massive impact on consumer experience, customer experience. I would be shocked if anyone said the current cookie consent interactions are the best they could possibly be for any consumer. We have this idea of consent fatigue, where users go to websites and they're not even meaningfully interacting with those interfaces. They're just either accepting or closing whatever to get to the content. then we want to think about, how do I also respect choices outside of just consent? So firstly, the ability to withdraw consent and take action upon that withdrawal, but also somebody wanting their data deleted or access to their data. We need to be able to respect those wishes and respond to them in full to build trust. Anyone who is interacting in any way with Apple over the last few years will have been familiar with their advertising campaigns around privacy, trust, and how their devices are the most secure. As I mentioned before, people are aware now that personal data is a currency that holds value. And so trust and transparency from a privacy perspective is a significant differentiator and marketing tool for brands that are willing to invest and build that and leverage that to improve brand perception. All of these things tie in together to think about, from the consumer experience, how do I make this seamless, but also respectful, also transparent, and also meaningful when I respond to a request or a query or a question? So we have opportunities here. And like we just saw previously, there are a number of options as to how we identify individuals. And historically, we've used sort of temporary cookie IDs, and then we've moved to a more probabilistic model where we can do matching through graphs, ID graphs. And then we're going to move to universal IDs. We'll hear a lot more about universal IDs, but the term that I liked earlier was authenticated, aligned with concepts like the IAB Project REARC, where a user will have a login process and will know for sure who they are. This is massively important when it comes to consent, because currently consent is tied to a device, and that's not necessarily even true. It might even be tied to a browser on a device. I save my consent settings when it comes to cookies and programmatic, and that's tied to my Chrome browser. I then go into my Firefox browser, onto the same website, and I get the same experience again. It's jarring. My choices have been made, but they're not able to be respected universally. And so we have this fatigue concept again. So where we can move towards a future state is tying consent to the user instead. So it's not device, it's me. It's not browser, it's Alex. And this allows for a few different things. One is you're able to remove that consent interface across all of your properties. So as a user, I can go to one of your properties and I can consent and we can share. Alternatively, if I go to one and I don't consent, maybe we choose to show it again on the second site that I go to, on the hope that I do actually opt in. That's another opportunity for us to maximize revenues there from a programmatic perspective. But also when we think cross-channel, cross-device, I'm able to have my choices respected in a meaningful way across all of my touch points with your brands and with your publications. Now, when it comes to the privacy rights, I mentioned deletion just because it's such a challenging topic, but it's much more broad than this. There is access of data, there is rectification of data, there's a number of rights under the GDPR. This is not just GDPR though. What we've seen is, as a result of GDPR, we've got CCPA. Arguably, as a result of GDPR, we've got CCPA in California, we've got changes in Brazil, India. Now, we're also seeing in the US that we have CCPA in action currently, but what we're calling CCPA 2, which is actually CPRA, is a next iteration of that. So this is not going away. And in all likelihood, we're going to see further adoption across the US and other Western markets of legislation that introduces this concept of rights for consumers, for data subjects, for individuals. And so we need to have a coherent approach, potentially at a global scale, to how we manage this. Right now, it's poor, I'll be honest, because we don't have a mechanism to correctly identify the individual at all times. So as a consumer, I could go to your website and I can make a request for my data to be deleted. I then go to a different website or use a different browser, and that choice is not being respected properly. We have a very different set of capabilities when we have the anonymous and the identified experiences. So again, like I mentioned before, when we have the concept of somebody telling us their email address and using that to opt out or have their data deleted, it's far more straightforward than relying on a cookie. There are significant challenges when it comes to actually meeting the legal obligations, and some legitimate questions as to whether they actually are today by many brands. It's very common to leverage an ID graph, which can combine a number of data points, a number of identifiers that relate to different providers, different technologies, even maybe tying that to an email address. And when I make a request to, let's say, a publisher using my email, and I say, I'd like you to delete my data, are they deleting and making requests out to third parties through APIs with regards to my cookie information that they know is linked to my email through that ID graph? Maybe not. It's a challenge, but it's also compounded by the fact that this is very difficult to propagate to third parties. There are a number of standards that attempt to deal with these sort of concepts. I don't think any of them have been totally successful. We are seeing a lot of work being done with regards to the CCPA under the IAB CCPA framework from the Tech Lab. But right now, it's often the case that for each third party, I need to call a unique API. I might use different identifiers. I've got a Google cookie ID, I've got an Amazon ID. And so it becomes very, very challenging for brands and publishers to make these requests and to fulfill them meaningfully. So as we introduce this concept of identity, universal identity and authenticated identity, it makes it far easier for brands and publishers to respect these choices. I can link them across channels, across devices, because they're tied to an identifier. Much easier to verify the validity of the request as well. And this improves user experience from a trust perspective. We can invoke a lot of transparency by using a consistent identifier to say, okay, well, I know that you made this request through this platform, this time and date. Have you changed your mind since then? We can be very comprehensive with our requests when we talk about utilizing those ID graphs. And the request propagation becomes a lot simpler. It makes it much easier for us to build standards around the identifier to help simplify making that request, pushing that downstream, and getting it out to third parties. And ultimately, when it comes to budget, there are significant savings here because identity enables automation. Automation reduces cost hugely. These requests are very difficult to facilitate, very labor intensive. So the automation possibilities here are enormous. As I mentioned, this is not just GDPR, it's CCPA and it's other legislation. So if you're not thinking about this today, I encourage you to do so and build it into your plan because these things will become more and more important, especially if you're looking to grow your business across country lines. Those are the two key things I wanted to cover today. I doubt I've managed to change everyone's mind who said disagree at the beginning, but hopefully a couple. I hope you see that there are massive opportunities here for improved user experience and that ultimately they were initiated and driven by privacy requirements. If you're interested in what we do as a business, you can visit preferencechoice.com and onetrust.com to have a look at our products. Preference Choice for the publisher-focused tooling that I focus on, and onetrust.com for this huge range of tools that we provide from data discovery to ethics to vendor management and GRC. There's a very, very broad range of tools. If you have any interest in any of these, feel free to reach out directly to me at acash@onetrust.com, visit the website and get in touch with the team there. With that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it. Thank you to IAB UK. And I hope the rest of the session today is very informative and enjoyable.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was brilliant. I was actually, from a personal objective, one of the disagree. And actually, it comes from the intrusiveness of banners sometimes. Actually, tying it to a universal identifier that recognises that I've made that decision is actually something I hadn't thought of before, but actually transitions us on quite nicely to our next topic. We have run out of time for questions, but what I will just remind everyone, if you do have any questions for any of our speakers, we will have some dedicated time at the end of the session. But if anything comes up along the way, then please do use the Q&A function. Thank you, Alex, and I hope you're available to answer some questions on the Q&A and later. With that, we'll hand over to our next speakers, who I was obviously very excited for earlier and almost skipped you, but thank you for that, Alex. And I'll move on to James. Confusion. James from Index Exchange and Matthew from ID5, who are going to be talking about universal identity solutions. I believe James is the first speaker, so I will hand over to you, James.
Yes, thank you, Tina. And let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen properly. I think that will be it there. Great. Is everyone able to see that?
Yep. Thanks, James.
Wow, that was quite easy. Great. Hello, everyone. My name is James Prudhomme. I'm the Executive Vice President of International Division at Index Exchange. So based here in London, moved here just about 5 years ago from Canada. So I'll get into it a little bit, talking about people-based marketing in a post-cookie world. There we go. Great. So just really quickly, who is Index Exchange? So we're an advertising exchange, an SSP, if you will. I think a lot of people use that term. We prefer the word or the term advertising exchange. We are a fully independent Canadian company, family owned, in fact, and we've never taken a dollar in outside investment. We reinvest very, very heavily back into engineering and product development. So more than 2/3 of our company is focused on engineering and product development. We started investing in identity and building an identity framework for the programmatic ecosystem quite a number of years ago. We sort of saw the writing on the wall, as it were, with regards to where the third-party cookie was going. So we made some decisions pretty early on to make this a core focus area for us as a company from an engineering point of view and from a product point of view. So our first significant launch, if you will, was with Trade Desk around the Universal ID in, I guess, in early 2018. We had spent a few years before that building the framework. And then we announced partnerships with LiveRamp after that, with Merkle, and I'll get into a little bit more of some of the other people that we work with. So, you know, when I say framework, what does that actually mean? And you know, a lot of the other presentations are kind of talking a lot about the vision, or if you will, or the future of kind of what identity is going to look like in a post-cookie world. And we certainly have a vision for that. And but at the same time, we don't think that, you know, the Index Exchange identifier should be the one identifier to rule them all. And in fact, you know, we don't really plan to have an identifier of our own in a post-cookie world. So we've really built a framework that can enable one or many different types of people-based identifiers. And so we've partnered with a number of companies around the world, including, you know, the NetID Foundation in Germany, the Trade Desk Unified ID Solution, you know, LiveRamp, Live Intent, Merkle, and the Mercury Adapter, and many more to come in terms of identity graph partners and partners who provide identifiers. So our main goal really is to turn the open web into the same people-based marketing machine that Facebook and Google and other walled gardens have become. And that really means unlocking or allowing a marketer to unlock the value and the power, if you will, of their CRM file. And why do we want to do this? Like, why is this so important? Well, the state of publishing today is a bit of a sorry one. There's publishers all over the world that are suffering, and certainly now in times of COVID, they're suffering probably even more. And the reason for this is not because publishers are not creating great content or providing users with great environments or creating fantastic user experiences. It's simply because more advertising dollars are flowing to platforms where identity is sort of to say infinitely addressable, where a marketer can take their CRM file. Now, whether that's a marketer, a huge, you know, packaged goods company that has millions of people in their CRM file, or whether that's a small corner cafe in central London that has a few hundred people on their email list. They can upload those lists of email addresses into Facebook, and they can very easily start to target those people. And so that's just created a scenario where tons and tons of advertiser and marketer dollars have flowed into these platforms. And it's really, you know, oftentimes not a lot left to flow into premium web publishers and independent media and very important news publications around the world. So that's fundamentally the problem that we're trying to solve. And we want to make the open web as addressable as the walled gardens. Now, we had embarked on that journey in the cookie-based world, and I think personally that the fact that third-party cookies are going away is actually, as a catalyst, probably the most amazing opportunity that web publishers have had for quite some time. I think the reason I think that is because it will force people to really embrace a people-based identity framework, and it will unlock those marketer CRM dollars in ways that I think publishers have never really seen before. So I think it's going to get really, really interesting. But it's going to be a journey, and you know, so how are we going to get there, and kind of where are we today? Well, here's our motorway or our highway, depending on what part of the world you come from. So where are we today? Well, you know, we're talking about universal IDs, universal identifier, and RTI adapters, and I'm really not going to talk a lot about universal identifiers, despite Tina's introduction. I'm going to leave that to Mathieu from ID5 because I think he's going to do a really excellent job of talking about that. What I will say is that the Index Exchange framework is designed to support universal identifiers like ID5 and to allow marketers to transact, publishers and marketers to transact on those identifiers. You know, we've also enabled different sort of real-time identity adapters for what I'll call the sort of modern era of DMPs, DMPs that are relying on first-party data and that are, you know, sort of quote-unquote cookieless. So that's kind of where we are today. A lot of people have deployed our identity library or other similar identity libraries, and these are the benefits that they're getting from them. They're solving some of the current problems around cookies, and they're making the integration of real-time data management systems a lot more efficient and a lot more scalable, far fewer network calls, you know, passing back key values back and forth, and that sort of thing. So that's great, and that's a good reason for, you know, people to get started with identity now. But the question is, you know, kind of what's the next step in the journey? And so the previous presentation talked a lot about logins and a lot about authenticated users, and IAB is very focused on Project Rearc. And I think that's what publishers and brands need to be thinking about today, which is how do you create an authenticated experience for a consumer that is valuable? Now, for some publishers, that's, you know, pretty easy. They just create a subscription-based business. Great, that's fine. People can subscribe to your website. If you happen to be, you know, the Financial Times or The Economist, or, you know, a really premium publication that people are willing to pay a lot of money for, or even, you know, The Guardian and others. But if you're not that, how do you create some kind of value exchange or value proposition for users to log in? You don't have to create a subscription business, but you really want users to be able to log in when they visit your website. So that's kind of the next step in the identity journey, right? So you start by kind of supporting universal IDs and various real-time identity adapters, and then publishers really need to immediately start thinking about logins, authenticated users, and that value exchange. Because cookies are going away really, really fast. And I think, you know, the 2-year announcement was made. It's going to come upon us very, very quickly. You know, the analogy is kind of like the boiling frog, right? We are all the frogs. We're in the pot. The heat's been turned on. You know, we can choose to start doing something about that now and making these types of investments. Or we can wait till the water is just raging and just boiling, and you know, we may not have an opportunity to escape. So, you know, as the cookie crumbles and as it goes away, those publishers and those brands who've made the investments into these first two steps along the journey are going to find it a lot easier to really make the shift to people-based identifiers and really make the shift to being able to unlock CRM data for the open web. So it's going to take time. It's going to take investment, you know, and it's going to take a lot of cooperation across the industry to get there. Things like Rearc are going to help companies get there. More and more identity graph partners are going to help companies get there. I think that single sign-on consortiums are something that are really, really interesting that we're seeing happen in the German market, for example, in France. Portugal's got one that I think that's become quite successful, yet to really see that kind of take place or get a lot of traction in the UK. But I think those are super, super interesting. And I think that, you know, publishers have to start taking these steps now and going along this journey now. And so what's that going to really look like? Well, this is kind of a you know, a rough framework of you know, what we think this looks like once a publisher has kind of deployed, figured out like a login experience and an authenticated experience, you know, and this is very, very similar to, I think, conceptually what's happening with Project Rearc, where, you know, a user shows up at a publisher website, they authenticate with their email address. That email address is hashed and encrypted and sent to an identity graph provider like LiveRamp, for example. They then match it with a marketer's CRM file, and that identifier with the characteristics or with the audience IDs and audience segments from that marketer's CRM file are then sent to the buyer DSP. So it becomes consistent across publishers based on using a consistent identity graph provider. It becomes scalable because marketers are able to reach consumers across multiple environments, mobile, desktop, browser-based, and it becomes valuable for publishers because they start seeing the same kinds of dollars and CPMs that Facebook, Google, Amazon, and other walled garden environments see today. So before I pass it off to Matthew, rather said, you know, what is going to be sort of the next steps for publishers and for buyers? I think for publishers, it's really start deploying identity libraries today on your website. Like I said, they solve some immediate short-term problems, but really start to think about it for, you know, the longer-term vision. For buyers, it's really around working with identity graph providers and starting to think about CRM onboarding. We are very soon launching our integration with LiveRamp in the UK and the rest of Europe. So this is something that can start happening now. And I think that brands should really start having conversations with these graph partners. For publishers, the next step is planning for an authenticated user experience. So really thinking about what is going to be that value exchange. Why will a user give me their email address in order to access my website and consume my content? What can I give them in return that they can't get somewhere else? And I think that's got to really start to drive a lot of strategic thinking from publishers. And of course, you know, continue to focus on creating that great premium content and continue to focus on creating great premium environments, because as tough as things look today, and as scary as the end of the third-party cookie might look to a lot of publishers, there is light at the end of the tunnel. And like I said, I believe this is probably one of the most important opportunities we've seen as an industry. And I couldn't possibly be more excited about it, to be perfectly honest. And so I think publishers and buyers stay focused on these three things. And over the coming months, as we get closer and closer to the demise of the cookie, I think that we're going to be in fine shape as an industry, and I think we're going to see more. We're going to see the open web flourish in ways that we haven't seen for many, many years. So, with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Mathieu, who is going to talk about common user identifiers in ID5. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, James, and good afternoon, everyone. Can someone tell me if the screen sharing is working okay?
It's just come out, yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you very much. Glad to be here. My name is Matthew Rush. I'm the CEO and co-founder of ID5, and we're a provider of identification solutions. So the goal of my short speech is to tell you how universal or shared identification solution work, and what's kind of behind this whole type of services. But maybe just to get started first, let's agree on a definition. And I'm going to disagree with Alex here. Data is not the currency. Inventory is not the currency. They are the assets that have to be traded using a currency. The currency is the means of exchange, and the currency in digital advertising is an identifier. This is what we use to connect a buyer and a seller so that they can trade assets, whether be it data or inventory. So when we're talking about a universal identifier, a shared identifier, we're talking about a common currency, right? I don't know if the euro is the best analogy, or the dollars or the yen, but it's a currency that has been adopted by enough people around the trading marketplace so that it gives scale and it enables seamless trading, right? And why we have to address this issue of seamless trading is because right now we are all using different identifiers, so different currencies that have to be synchronized or translated with each other, right? And so the purpose of universal identifiers, at least the initial purpose of universal identifiers, was to be able to replace cookie-based identifiers that had to be synchronized with each other. So there are different types of identifiers. When we talk about identity, it's a very broad topic. There's basically, we like to summarize this as being 3 layers, right? There is a device ID, which is a unique string of character that is associated to the device, or in the case of the web, the browser on the device. This is the base layer, right? Then on top of that, you have what we call a user ID, which is an identifier that is at people level, at user level, and that connects the different devices that a user will use, its phone, its computer, connected television, et cetera, right? And then if you take it one step up from this, there is what we call a customer ID, which is an identifier that basically bridges the online identity of the user across all of its devices with its offline identity, right? So specifically something that enables offline identification, such as a name and an address, or a phone number, or an email address. This is what we'll have at a customer level, which will enable this offline to online reconciliation. When we talk about universal IDs in the technical sense of the term, we talk about a device ID, right? And a unique device ID that can be shared by everyone, so that we have this currency to trade information connected to that device, whether it's through a user ID or a customer ID, but really connected to that device. Why do we even have that discussion? Well, universal ID initially were created to solve the problem raised by cookie matching. There are several problems. Cookie matching is basically the process by which a platform's specific identifier, like an index ID or a MediaMath ID or an AppNexus ID, will be connected with the other platform's identifier. There's 2 platforms in transaction, a buyer and a seller, so that they can trade with each other. They need to connect their identifiers. This process is called cookie matching, right? And it creates a lot of issues, especially for publisher. It opens up a lot of privacy compliance problems, because basically we're sharing personal data with people that we don't necessarily know, or with whom we don't control the usage of the data. It doesn't fit the transparency and the control requirements, in particular of the GDPR. It opens up a lot of risks of data leakage for publishers. Plenty of people through cookie matching have access to a user ID and a page URL, which means that they can suck up information about users without asking for permission, which is obviously a problem for publisher. Creates massive performance issues. On some website, there are hundreds of cookie matching pixels being fired, taking several seconds to load, so slowing down the page and impacting the experience of the user. And last but not least, this matching is an exponential problem. And as any exponential problem, it doesn't scale well. So the more you need to match your ID with a lot of platforms, which you want to do to maximize, buying capabilities and selling capabilities, the more you're going to lose efficiency and accuracy, right? The problem of match rate is a very big problem, because it translates into loss of value for publishers. They cannot monetize all their assets because they don't have a perfect match rate with buyers. And it's a problem for brands, because they cannot reach their audiences as broadly and as much at scale as they would like, right? The second reason why universal IDs are becoming more and more important is the elephant in the room. Proprietary IDs, platform-specific IDs that we've been using since the beginning of digital advertising are, by definition, proprietary to third parties to the sites. So the only place where they can be stored and retrieved by the third party is in a third-party cookie. And as has been mentioned already, third-party cookies are going away. They're already gone in some cases. They're going away across the board. We will not have this ability as a third party. Platform will not have the ability to store their own identifier on a device. So they need to rely on something else, on another identifier, something that can be shared across the board. So this is why we need universal identifiers or shared identifiers, so that we can solve the problem caused by cookie matching and also anticipate the disappearance of third-party cookies and move to a world where we don't need to store an ID as a third party, because this ID is provided to us in a universal fashion by an entity or by a publisher. So there's a number of initiatives that have been created to solve this problem and to create this unification layer, shared identity layer, solving the cookie matching and or the storage problem. This is an example. This is the list actually of as of today or last week of the ID modules available in Prebid, which is as good a proxy or a market research tool as any, because it's a open source sell-side solution that's been adopted by tens of thousands of publishers globally. So this gives you a kind of an overview of the different initiatives that are available today to replace a cookie-based solution. They're not all the same, and I think it's interesting to kind of position them on a simple 2x2 map. The world where we come from is a world of proprietary IDs, platform-specific IDs. All of the Lumascape logos that have their own ID, and it's stored on a third-party cookie that they can access on a page, right? This is where we come from. This is what's not going to work in the future. There's two directions that we can use. One is a direction of making this identifier universal, right? So instead of having to trade hundreds of different IDs, let's use the same currency, let's use one language. This is the initiative that's been addressed by Digitrust 5 or 6 years ago, that the Trade Desk with its unified ID solution was also looking to address, building a common currency, building a common language, right? This is the universal dimension. But those two initiatives still rely on third-party cookies. So they are a great solution to solve for the problems of cookie matching. They are not a solution to solve for the problem of the third-party cookie disappearing. On the other side of the chart, you have some proprietary IDs, Criteo being the example that's available in the Prebid list, proprietary IDs that are moving to first parties, right? In order not necessarily to solve the problem of matching or reconciliation or trading within the industry with a better mechanism, but in order to solve the problem of storage of that ID by dropping it in a first party in the publisher context, right? Again, a solution to the cookie problem, not a solution to the matching or the trading within the ecosystem problem. So really, when you narrow it down, there's those 6 initiatives that are on the top right corner here that are trying to address both the universality angle. Let's get rid of third-party of proprietary IDs, and let's work with one language, or in this case, a handful of languages. And let's not store this ID, this currency, in a third-party cookie. Let's store it in first-party, because that's where we can improve security, we can improve transparency, we can improve publisher control, we can improve user control. So how do we power those shared ID? This currency has to be backed by something. Technically, you cannot, you need something that tells you that on website A and website B, it's the same user, right? And there's two types of things, two types of informations that you can use. What we'll call declared identifiers, right? Will be backed by authentication methods, an email, a phone number that will be consistent across websites, right? That's one method of building an ID. And the other method is inferred identifiers, using signals, passive signals, to build an ID that is also consistent across websites. And between those two methods, it's mostly a dilemma of scale versus accuracy, right? You can argue that declared IDs, authenticated users, hashed email address, are more accurate, because they are provided by users. They have other advantages, such as being available across devices and in different contexts and environments. So let's put them at the top of the pyramid, right? There are other deterministic signals. We're having discussion with telco operators, for instance, or providers of people working with telco operators to get its deterministic signal from the telco to enable this authenticated experience or declared identification experience, deterministic identification experience. Okay, great. Main problem, scale. Right now, a very, very small percentage of traffic is logged in to websites. There's a lot of telcos globally, right? So it's very difficult to have a scale and large coverage on a deterministic level to identify users, right? And yes, publishers should think about their product strategy and think about encouraging users to log in and encouraging users to redesign their experience to encourage this. But it's a challenge. It's a complicated transition from where we come from, which is basically free access to content, an implicit value exchange. We need to go to an explicit value exchange. It's not going to be an easy road, especially since the most recent discussion from the European Data Privacy Board, which has basically ruled out cookie walls, isn't going to make it easier. So declared IDs, interesting, but probably not sufficient to cover the scale of the market and the scale of the audience that we want to address. Inferred IDs have a lot more scale. And so that's why we need to look at those two things in parallel. We can build probabilistic models using algorithm to understand patterns of navigation that give you enough confidence that user on site A and user on site B are the same one, and so can be attributed the same identifier, right? And we strongly believe at ID5 that this is really the combination of declared IDs and inferred IDs that will enable us to minimize the amount of anonymous users. With anonymous users, we won't have a lot of solutions to identify them. We'll have a cohort solution, probably. Browsers seem to be working towards ways to signal information such as belonging to a certain segment and things like that, or contextual targeting, which doesn't solve for frequency capping, which doesn't solve for performance and attribution, which are also key applications of user IDs. So really the goal is that the top two layers cover as much as possible of the population so that we're left with a very small part of anonymous users, because if they are anonymous, they are about 50 or 60% less valuable for brands. And so they generate 50 or 60% less money for publishers. So this is very difficult to base an advertising business model on anonymous users. And that's why we need to build identification method, whether declared or inferred, whatever we have available to us, to help publishers power this advertising model and help them provide to brands the audiences they want to engage with. So that's the situation we're in. Universal IDs are coming. They are here in some cases. Everyone needs to prepare for it. This is not something that one company can adopt on its own. It is an ecosystem. It is a marketplace. Think of it as a currency. It is something that needs to be adopted at scale to be valuable. And the more it is adopted, the more it is valuable. So the advice that we give to publishers as well as agencies and brands, and obviously the ad tech players that are in the middle, is to implement. James said it, there's a lot of solutions that are available, whether on the buy side, on the sell side, through the technologies you're using. Implement it, test it, and measure the benefits, measure the performance. We already have a subset of the market that is like a window into the future, right? Safari and Firefox users today, you cannot identify, you cannot target, you cannot measure the performance. So use this as a test bed for what's coming. Use this to learn about what's coming, and use this to measure what you can gain as a publisher or as a brand in terms of addressability of that audience. We've just released a guide, the Advertising Identity Guide. You have the URL on the page. If you want more information, if you want more details on this topic, please go and visit this. And that's about it for me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Matthew and James. We actually are running a bit over, so I'm not going to open any time for questions now. But again, if you have any, please do post them in the Q&A. And again, we'll have some time to answer questions later. But thank you to our speakers in the first half of our session. We now have a break. We originally had scheduled this for 15 minutes, but if I could ask everyone to be back in 5 minutes, you're at home, so take a walk, grab a snack, catch a tan, whatever it is, but please join us back in 5 minutes. So we'll be ready to start at 4:28, and we'll see you then to be talking about first-party data, contextual targeting, and in-app. So thank you all for joining us so far, and we'll see you shortly. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second part of our user identity seminar. Our next speaker is Amit, who is the marketing director at Permutive, and he will be talking about the value of first-party data in a cookieless world. Over to you, Amit.
Thanks, Tina. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay. Is that all good? You can see that?
Yep, we can see it. Thank you.
Amazing. Yeah, I just want to echo what Tina said earlier. Really thanks to everyone for attending today. I'm pretty sure you'd rather be in the sun than listening to a bunch of us talk about IDs. But thank you. I'm here today to talk about, well, first of all, I'm Amit Katecha. I'm the Global Marketing Director at Permutive. I'm quite happy to be here because I'm kind of feel like a little bit out of place because Permutive doesn't really have an ID solution. But what we do is we help publishers really understand their first party data so that they can make more money and actually see the value of it. And also I'm going to come at this subject today from the lens of a publisher, as we only work with publishers today. But however, I guess everything I say will apply to agencies and advertisers too. So hopefully everyone will have something they can take away from this presentation. So about 2 years ago, I started working at Permutive, who were going out in market and talking to publishers, not just to sell their technology, but also to talk to them about their first party data strategy. Back then, there were a lot of publishers who hadn't really thought about it or just didn't know where to start. And this was because they hadn't really been impacted in any way and their business was doing okay. And there was a lot of like bounded rationality. Everyone was kind of limited by the amount of knowledge that they had on the topic. And so they were kind of happy with the status quo. It was about this time that Apple, I think everyone's mentioned it so far, Apple made a significant change to their browser through ITP 2.1. And overnight publishers saw this massive impact on their revenue. Some publishers, as much as 30%, they saw a drop of 30% just overnight. So we're here today because Google made a similar announcement in January, which everyone's talked about so far. And and I've been out in market over the last few months talking to media buyers. And I'm hearing really similar things from media buyers as I was from publishers back 2 years ago. Someone else will fix it. We still have access to third-party cookies, so we're all good for today. The industry is going to create a new ID. All the browsers will sort it out. And it got me thinking about a story, something that impacted me a little while ago in 2014, when the London Underground had a tube strike. And a lot of people, a lot of businesses were massively affected. I'm sure everyone on this call was. And it meant that less than 50% of trains were still running, with lines cut short and services restricted to only running once or twice an hour. And back then, video conferencing wasn't as good as it is today. So people had to make a choice. You either work from home or you find an alternate way to get to work. This meant that hundreds and thousands of people were affected. And there was a really interesting study that was done straight after. And it found that about 5% of the population found a faster and more convenient way to get to work. And I was one of them. I was no longer bounded by the TfL website, who for 7 years had told me that I needed to get 3 trains to work. I found a quicker route to work and it saved me about 10 minutes each way. So that was like 20% of my day saved because of the tube strike. I'd been forced to find an alternative because which was actually better than my original route. And this like tangentially like relates to because a lot of people today are kind of bemoaning about the decline of the cookie. And this is just like a tube strike, right? It's prompting us to find positive alternative ways on how the ecosystem can operate in the future. And the truth is that there's kind of been a tube strike going on for 2 years. The strike, unfortunately, has only really affected the publishers' bottom line until recently. This has been driven from 2 areas mainly, which are regulations and browsers, and everyone's talked about that today. And the browsers have been much more forceful. Safari and Firefox have had this kind of zero tolerance to cookies. Hello, it's not working. And we've seen a lot of news about this. I think there was some slides earlier about this too. And we expect these restrictions to become much more stricter and much more impactful to the online ad tech ecosystem and all the businesses that work in it moving forward, if companies still rely on third-party cookies. So today, according to like our data, we see about 40% of the web which is untargetable with third-party cookies. All of this traffic goes to publishers' sites and can't be monetized, can't be measured in the same way as it is on Chrome. This 40% is a significant amount of users, and some would argue that these are the most valuable users that there are online. And so publishers have felt this first, they felt it overnight, and this is why a lot of publishers globally have been spending a lot of time and resource creating first-party data strategies. And we're lucky to work with over 70 of them today. They all saw this coming, and they are all ready for when it becomes a bit of a reality and 100% of their users just go dark. And so I think the first presentation showed kind of the IAB's definition of the web, you know, the segments, the 3 segments. There's actually 4 segments, but I think there's actually only 3 because we don't know enough about the sandbox to talk about it today. So the way we see the web is that it's split into 3. There's authenticated, which are users that have logged in or have a common identifier. There's the recognized web, which is based on third-party cookies. And then there's the anonymous web, where these users aren't anonymous to the publisher, they're anonymous to everyone else apart from the publisher. And the publisher can still monetize those users through private marketplaces, and they can still be monetized through contextual targeting. Then you can see by the arrows, they're all trending in different directions. And in the future, I believe the world's going to look a lot more like this. The amount of traffic that will be authenticated by publishers is going to be limited for most. It's literally impossible for most publishers to ask every user to log in. It's definitely going to grow, and it will be, but it will always be a small percentage. A really important percentage, it's a really important percentage because the data that's in there is valuable. And can be potentially modeled out in the future across one domain. The anonymous web will become the largest part of the web, and the open marketplace infrastructure that we have today isn't fit for this web. The only companies that will be able to understand the user will be the ones that have a direct relationship with the user. And in the advertising world, this means that it's most likely going to be the publisher and the advertiser. For all the companies that do not have a relationship, it's the right time to start partnering with companies that do. And it's really important because I'm surprised no one's brought this up already today, but ISBA did a study for 2 years measuring the supply chain of programmatic, and this caused a lot of press last week. I'm sure most of you have read it. If you haven't, you should. And it basically showed, you know, some highlights where 51% of every pound in the UK goes to the publisher. And there's this like unknown delta of 15% that's just going missing in the programmatic ecosystem. One of the recommendations that ISBA made to advertisers, and they've been presenting this to advertisers over the last few days, was to work closer with publishers to ensure that their media was being delivered where it's supposed to be. And we believe it's really important because if you were to look at just the open marketplace stats from this study and break it down by browser, yet to see those results, there's no doubt that the amount of revenue received by the publisher in Safari would be incredibly low. And so to explain this in more detail, and apologies, like I was told that this was to keep it really high level today. So I wanted to show you in a flowchart what actually happens in the open marketplace and take a look at what actually happens with bids in the open marketplace. So when an ad comes up for sale on a publisher's site, so an ad slot is generated, in Chrome, a publisher will look and see in their ID solution, do I know this user? If they do know the user, in this case it's ID equals ABC, they will pass that information along to their exchange or SSP. And what will happen is the buyer will then try to connect this data to something that they know about this user. And if there's a match, then, and in this case, we know that this person's into tech or sport because they've connected it to a third-party data provider. They're likely to bid quite high for it. And this is the way that the open marketplace works today. If you go to Safari, as soon as the ad comes up for sale, there's no way to understand that user. So when the publisher passes the information down the chain, there is no information. If the buyer cannot perform a match, it's likely that they'll bid very low, or in some cases, they may not bid at all. And I think the most concerning thing for me is that over the last 6 months, I've spoken to many DSPs and agencies, and a lot of them have rules that they will not bid on Safari inventory. And I think Mattia talked about it earlier that, or I think James might have, that buyers have moved their money to areas where they can measure. And this is 40% of users, 40% of impressions that publishers are creating that are not being monetized to their full amount. So what's become really clear and apparent is, since these browser changes, is that publishers hold the keys to audience data. And you're going to need two things to target media in the future. You're going to need users. So you're going to need the legal consent, as we've heard from OneTrust today, directly from the user. And you're going to need that relationship with the user. And then you're going to need the inventory. So data on the user can only be used for ads that are on the domain the user's on. The use of IDs can be used, but just on the publisher's domain. As soon as it leaves the domain, it won't be identifiable anymore, because the browsers have been very clear that they're going to shut this down. So if you do not have any of these, then it's likely that you're going to feel impact in the future. And to put this in context, I mentioned publishers saw this coming. Just an example here from Immediate Media in the UK, who a couple of years ago saw this drop in revenue from Safari, and then they put together a first-party data strategy. They increased the volume of the data they collected. They saw a huge increase in the audiences that they could target, and they communicated this to buyers in a way that appealed to advertisers. And they saw over 100% increase in their revenue during this time. So if something's forced on you and the old ways of doing things aren't possible anymore, you have to think differently, right? And we believe every company should be building the future of programmatic advertising with three things moving forward. The first is privacy, and it has to be first. User privacy cannot be breached. And it's one of those strange things that, like, you know, when you hear presentations in our industry, no one talks about this enough. And we believe that the publisher will be the gatekeeper of audience data, and it won't be allowed off their domain for tracking. You can see this tweet by John Willander, who's one of the creators of ITP, about cross-site tracking here. If you're currently thinking about solutions in the market, please keep this in mind, because it's something that I feel, as I mentioned, that ad tech usually puts privacy way down on the list. The second is scale. As I showed you with Immediate Media, there are a number of publishers out there that have scale and are able to deliver targeted advertising across all of their impressions, even on Safari and Firefox. And brands and agencies should be building closer relationships with them and finding out how to build audiences that are valuable. And the final one is trust. I'm still amazed that third-party data has lasted this long. There's been little transparency around the fidelity of that data that's available. And if publisher data is going to become a new currency, then we'll need to create a common language that is transparent and can be trusted. You can see a quote here from Lawrence Dodds from Universal McCann. These are things that we spend at Permutive a lot of time thinking about, these three pillars, and we've got a lot of more information we can provide on each one. But for now, if you're a publisher and you haven't sorted out your first-party data strategy, please start today. It's still not too late, but you've got some catching up to do. And if you're an advertiser and agency, start talking to publishers more. Just to give you an example of this, we had a roundtable in the US last week, and an agency said, sometimes we don't ask for stuff from media owners because we feel like we're asking too much. And the reply in the room from all the major publishers was, you don't ask enough. And I think over the last few years, this has become really apparent that there needs to be a better dialogue for both sides. And something that we as a company are constantly trying to do is get both sides together more often. So finally, publishers will hold the audience data moving forward. And first-party data will likely become the most valuable currency moving forward. Which means that publishers will become data providers as well as content and media providers. And for the last 10 years, they've kind of decoupled or separated the two. and they've given their data away to third parties. This is no longer possible on browsers. It's not going to be the way forward. And finally, all the roads that we can see lead to a closer relationship. It's really clear from the ISBAR study, if you look at the recommendations, that advertisers and publishers need to work closer together, not just to connect their authenticated audiences, but more strategically than that. In the last 10 years, the gap between the advertiser and the publisher has really widened, and it's been filled with lots of different technology players, most of which have built their businesses on third-party cookies. This isn't going to be the future, so change is definitely needed. So I'm going to end there, Tina. If you have any questions or anything, just email us at hello@permitive.com. And I will try and be here at the end for questions. I might have to leave before then.
Thank you so much, Amit. That was great, and yeah, really interesting to hear Permitive's position on the value of publishers in a post-cookie world. So thank you for that. You mentioned within your presentation about the ISBAR study. So thanks for calling that out. That's a really big topic to get into. So if you are interested in hearing what IAB has to say on it, then please do look on our website to hear our response, and just to make you aware, we are aware and engaged in the work that continues on that. So yeah, lots to do there still, but yes, thank you for mentioning. I believe, Amit, so we'll hold here for any questions. I can't see any in the Q&A at the moment. If you are unable to answer, then we will be sharing these slides around. Great animations, by the way. But if not, then please do drop Permitive an email address where they can get an email where they can get back to you there directly. I've not seen anything come out in Q&A so far, so I will move on to our next speaker. But thank you so much for that.
No worries.
Our next speaker is Mark from Smartology. So Smartology are a contextual targeting company. Well, I'll let him do the explanation about who they are, but Smartology are here today to talk about contextual targeting and the relevance and importance of it in a post-cookie world. I will also just use, before we go into it, a moment to just call out that we are doing some work on producing a contextual targeting white paper that essentially will cover, I guess, some of the topics that Smartology will be talking about today. So again, you can keep up to date with the work that we're doing on that on our user identity hub. But for now, I will hand over to Mark from Smartology to talk about contextual targeting. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Tina. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and great to be involved with the IAB and also your white paper on contextual targeting. Let me share my screen, bear with me. So my name is Mark Bembridge. I'm the founder and CEO of Smartology. We specialize in contextual targeting. I just want to check, can everybody see my screen there?
We can see your screen, thank you.
Great. So we've talked a lot, I'm going to race through these first few slides. We've talked a lot about, how privacy matters, the onset of GDPR, ITP 2.2 with Safari and Firefox switching off cookie tracking, and now CCPA coming into practice to be enforced, I think, from July this year. GDPR as well, we expect to see significantly more enforcement sort of as COVID dies down in due course. And of course, Google announcing the intention to phase out cookies. I liked what Amit had to say there from Permitive, great company, doing some very exciting work, and his point really about the importance of privacy, and that perhaps that's been underplayed in the industry. I spoke at a conference a couple of years ago in Brussels with Jan Albrecht, who was partly responsible for the German MEP for writing GDPR. And on the stage with us was a lady from Privacy International who had asked, under the Freedom of Information Act here in the UK, from a data provider, for all the data they held on her. And I always remember her standing up with this document that she printed out. It was 60 pages long. It had a page and a half on her sexual preferences, had a page on her neuroses, and she sort of explained that she knew more about herself having read that document that she did before. So I don't think it's I think privacy in the industry is a big threat and a big issue, and understandably so. I think from a citizen's perspective, I don't think it can be underestimated how citizens in many cases don't even realize how bad the situation is in terms of how much data on them is out there. And B, that there is certainly lots of evidence to prove that citizens increasingly are taking it very seriously and are certainly very concerned about the potential. So I don't think we can underline enough how much privacy matters. We've talked today as well about Safari and Firefox knocking out cookies at the browser level. We've talked about ID solutions, which, whilst absolutely have potential going forward, are still relatively nascent. I mean, they're evolving quickly as is demanded by the industry, and that's certainly a positive step in the right direction. But there's some way to go. There are also a lot of different first-party potential ID solutions out there, and there's a lot of talk about, will one become more prevalent? Will we have quite a fragmented period whilst different companies are being used across the sector, which perhaps confuses issues to begin with. So I think there's some way to go there. And in the meantime, there has been a lot of talk about how contextual targeting is coming back, is making a comeback. Context has always been key. Brands advertise and have always advertised carefully on media owners that are relevant to them. If you're a bank, you are more likely to be an investment bank. You're more likely to be advertising on the Financial Times. If you're a sports brand, you're more likely to be advertising on ESPN, etc. Context has always been important. It started obviously in the very early days with keyword matching around AdWords, which is obviously now much more sophisticated. That caused all kinds of spurious matches. I have another deck which I won't share today, but of very entertaining matches that have happened in the past based on keyword matching technology. We saw in-text ads start appearing through the likes of Vibrant Media, where there were links within the articles themselves that clicked off to various different sites, which again could be considered contextual. But contextual really grew up as programmatic evolved. Grapeshot was certainly the major market leader, obviously acquired by Oracle, and did a brilliant job of scaling contextual across trading desks around the world, working closely with all of the agencies and allowing them to build contextual segments against which to target ads. But in the main, primarily that was a static banner. So you were able to put a static traditional banner ad about, I don't know, a banking brand alongside finance pages, or a sports brand alongside sports articles contextually. We've been doing a lot of work at Smalltology over several years, harnessing natural language process taxonomies and base AI technology, which really is a fascinating area because it allows us for the first time to really understand in detail and with real granularity what the content on a page being published at article level to the minute by publishers around the world, what that page is about. In addition, we've seen a huge increase, over 50% of advertising online these days is content-led. And we've seen a huge increase specifically with social media and the rise of social media, with brands needing to move their advertising strategies to harness content marketing and producing branded content, whether that's PDF reports or blogs and editorial or video. Brands are communicating much more often throughout the week, day in, day out in many cases, in order to tell stories that are relevant to their customers and push thought leadership out there. If we couple the ability to read publisher content with the ability to read and understand branded content, it allows the contextual targeting capability to evolve to a new level, and alongside that to not only address privacy challenges, but also to look at challenges including transparency, which Amit referred there to the fascinating ISBA report written by Sam Tomlinson at PwC, not only to help solve transparency, but also brand safety. If you know what's on the page, you're in a position to understand that there is something inappropriate that a brand would not like to be associated with. And if you can do that semantically, harnessing innovative technology, then you're not just keyword matching, which is a monumental task to track all of the various different inappropriate words on an ongoing basis. So let's talk a little bit about the cookie alternative, and how do we go about targeting contextually. What we do is term extraction on publisher articles around the world, so that we understand that an article's main topics, in this case, are around cars, vehicles, and electric cars in particular. We have weighted profiles that cluster words semantically, so that we understand that electric cars are related to battery-run vehicles. And so we're not just keyword matching, we're understanding at a much deeper level the relationship between words, and we're also understanding what are the main weighted topics of an article. So what is an article mainly about, and then less so about. That allows us to build these, in the first place, algorithms to build these what we call semantic vectors or profiles, both of the client's content. That might be 5 pieces of content, that might be, we've seen clients in the past with over 1,000 pieces of content. And the first algorithm builds those profiles. The second algorithm is a matching algorithm that allows us to inject, using dynamic creatives, the most relevant piece of content from a client, from a brand, into that ad unit contextually alongside the article. So let's have a look at how that works in practice. We're reading an article about everybody's favorite topic until certainly during last year, Brexit. And the Alliance Bernstein ad in this case is relevant to that which the reader is using about. The same campaign is running. We're now talking about the Fed and wages, and the ad is changing to be relevant to that which is on the page at a very granular level of detail. The fact that a user has just chosen to read about that topic, and this is a critically important point, means that they're emotionally tuned into that in this moment in time where they've chosen to read into that subject area. And therefore the ability for a brand to put thought leadership out there, a respected brand in that moment, we've been able to prove over and over that the ability with new technology to harness contextual targeting at this level means that you will see a much higher propensity to engage by the user. And that translates into significantly higher, not only CTR, but post-click attribution in terms of dwell times and outcomes. We can run videos. We're talking about climate change, and here we're talking about the future of energy with a video. And it's about that ability to speak to a user, to join a conversation with a user in the moment that they are interested in that topic. And what we're doing here is we're matching content to content. At Smartology, we've on many an occasion been asked to overlay third-party cookie data, and we've always walked away from that on the basis that we always felt, since the company was founded several years ago, that context would always win out in terms of high-level, what can be described sometimes as rather shifty third-party audience data, that the context wins out in terms of engagement. And if you're a brand running on the right publisher, you in principle have the right audience if you're talking to them in the right moment with the right piece of content. In terms of tracking, it allows us to understand which content items are most prevalent in terms of attribution and performance. which gives a hugely valuable feedback loop back into the brand in terms of what's performing. And I'm constantly fascinated by the results of contextual targeting done at a new level of evolution in terms of, case study, for example, that we published end of last year with Mishcon Rea, the legal firm, where you can see here that 0.58% click-through rates, over 80% viewability when scored on Moat, 40% higher than the benchmark, 1.8 minute dwell time. We shouldn't underestimate that contextual, when it's done well and done correctly, can have a very, very dramatic effect on performance. And in fact, in most cases, far and away improve performance over the ability of any audience-based targeting techniques that have been used in the past. Now, that is not to say that we shouldn't be looking at alternatives to cookies that are only contextual. We are very cognizant of the fact that, and very supportive of the fact that the IAB's work with TCF 2.0, for example, which we're part of and are implementing as we speak, that the initiatives that are being taken across the industry to combat privacy and move the industry forward with consent from the user, we're hugely supportive of that. And we do feel that in due course, as true consent can be properly measured and implemented, that there is a very exciting future where context and first-party database consent-driven targeting can be combined to give marketers the best of both worlds. We do need to be careful that to always bear in mind that scale is always going to be an issue for a client, and to combine context with audience targeting with the various different ID solutions in the future will mean that the two combined tend to shrink the available inventory to something much, much smaller, which will be an ongoing issue. But we expect that will translate in due course to higher CPMs to compensate for that. It's also important that context, to note that context is cookie free, but we do require a web page URL in terms of through the bid request programmatically to understand what page that user is viewing. At the moment, still, that is absolutely passed through in the programmatic bid stream. We obfuscate all other data shared in the bid request, and again, that's important because working programmatically, you are passed through data on all sorts of levels, which we feel is much more threatening to an end user in terms of their location and their privacy around the browser that they're using, or the device that they're using. But we need that page in order to make the match, but it doesn't give any other data out from the perspective of the user in terms of them as individuals. Matching content to content without tracking behavior or targeting based on audience data will deliver high engagement. And I think really that's an important point to take from this, is that a lot of people are saying we're going to have to move back to contextual, and we'll never get as high performance as we have done in the past. And we've worked with many of the world's largest, we work at the moment with about 70 of the world's largest premium publishers globally, out of London, New York, and Singapore. And we have endless scenarios of publishers saying to us that every single campaign we run with them has much higher performance than any audience targeted campaigns they run. And I think that's important to bust that myth that context results will never perform as well when we're thinking about alternatives as the industry evolves to bring in new techniques to target audiences based on first-party data. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of context to fill that gap. And we are seeing many, many new clients talking to us at the moment about moving to context in a more privacy-conscious industry and world. I have a last couple of points which I just think are interesting again in the context, shall we say, of this current economic and COVID-19 crisis, that are related to context. And I think it's been fascinating for us to see during this crisis how content has played a huge part in brands looking to run campaigns. They're seeing content as a much more sensitive way for them to be able to speak to their target audiences, from a perspective of marketing in a more sensitive way, speaking to the problems that are out there through thought leadership and communications based on primarily, in fact, editorial content. I'm also going to mention that context has given them a huge ability to find the right environment. What we've seen is that pretty much every client that we have has swapped out their content for content that is related to this COVID-19 crisis. They are actually keen to talk about the crisis and what that means to their customers and what they're doing at this time to cope with the crisis. If you're an investment bank, you'll want to be talking about market volatility during the crisis and how you see that and your expertise around that. If you're in healthcare, you'll want to be speaking about quite specific issues within healthcare. And I think context has been fascinating for me in the perspective that we see a lot of brand safety crises going on with clients panicking that they don't want to be alongside COVID-19 articles. We have seen quite the opposite, in that they do want to be in the right time at the right place, but they need that granular level of contextual accuracy, given the current news cycle, to appear alongside the right type of COVID-19 crisis articles where they're seen to add value. And I think the resulting performance spike gives me, a heartening position in terms of looking at the industry with a solution that proves that context in a time where privacy is a huge issue across the industry, but also combined with this current crisis that we're seeing in the industry from the economic and difficult, challenging times that the COVID-19 crisis has brought to the forefront. And we're excited about the fact that, despite many companies really, understandably struggling, we've seen a couple of very small cancellations and a very significant uplift in revenue generation. So I think context, to summarize, has got a huge part to play in the coming months and years as we evolve into new first-party led, consent-driven audience targeting solutions. And I'm excited to see context combined with those solutions in due course, and certainly to help fill a gap in the meantime during what is a very difficult time for the industry on many levels. And I think it's a huge part to play there. So I hope that was helpful, and thank you very much, Tina and the IAB, for having me on. And look forward to following up again in due course.
Thank you so much, Mark. We've not had any questions come up in the Q&A, but I believe you are staying around for the Q&A at the end, so there may be something that comes up there. Thank you, and kind of within your presentation you mentioned or kind of referenced a few pieces of work that we have going on, and again, just recommend everyone to keep an eye on our website for information about all the various projects and work that have been referenced throughout today's presentations. Thank you so much, Mark, for your time and your presentation.
Thank you.
I will now hand over to Andy, who is the General Manager for UK at Adjust, and he's going to be talking about something slightly different, which is in-app environments, and I believe touching on connected TV and how those channels or environments apply or are affected by a post-cookie world. So thank you, Andy, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Great introduction. Talking about something slightly different. That may well be a theme of my talk. I believe we have a poll that I just thought would be interesting to set up first off. If the poll can come on, and if everyone can stand up while taking the poll, I think it will be useful. It's been a very informative but very long session, and I appreciate that. It's great that everyone's kind of stuck in there. But yeah, for a hot day where we can see the sunshine outside, it's certainly been a long one, so I appreciate your time. And I'll try to get through this fairly quickly, so that we can have some time for questions and have some interaction. I know, having done a few of these webinars now, it's quite disturbing not having any back and forth with the people who are listening to you. So hopefully we can get to some questions and we can answer some questions from everyone who's listening in. But as Tina said, I'm here to speak about identity in the in-app world, and really the in-app world is very different to the web world. These are just some of the identifiers that I have on my phone. So you can see from this that actually I share my heartbeat with two different businesses. So, you know, in-app, the identities that are shared really go far beyond what we would consider an identifier in the advertising world. And really those identifiers are specifically there because of the intention behind asking for those identifiers. Right? Obviously my body sensor, my heartbeat is there because of the fitness app that I use, so I'm happy to share that identifier. And I think that intention for app really goes beyond what we would consider, you know, consent, into a very intentional sharing of that identity with businesses, which I think is an important differential just to kind of kick off with. So the hopefully going through the slides, there we go. Click on my mouse rather than using the arrow keys, shows how retro I am. So yeah, just to speak about the fact that we live in an app first world, have a bit of a comparison between web and app, and sort of bring out the fact that that's always been where the differential was, and that, you know, we would traditionally talk about desktop and mobile, and that's not really the case. To talk to deep dive a bit into that consent and intent in the app world, and then talk about cookies and mobile IDs as we see them, to kind of go through the history of those, and then speaking specifically to the app world and to mobile apps, break it down into experience, targeting, and effectiveness, and then just on a little look into the future. So, you know, there could be no doubt that we live in an app world. You know, more than double the amount of time spent in mobile apps than on desktop web, and that's only ever going to increase. I wonder if you can pick up the ice cream truck outside my window. But yeah, that's only ever going to increase. You know, the fact is that connected TVs are based on an app world. You know, as the console tries to move into the living room, those are very much app-based systems, with, you know, companies such as Ring, Google Nest, and services coming in. The Internet of Things is obviously, you know, built on that app ecosystem rather than the web ecosystem. And then super apps, you know, definitely the trend that we see. And this can be seen throughout the industry. This is actually from Operating Partner, which is a newsletter by Darren Herman's, fantastic newsletter. I definitely recommend for anyone in the industry who's interested in finding out information. It's a great newsletter to be subscribed to. But, you know, he kind of points out that, you know, cookies are more kind of Internet 1.0 and you know, the future, you know, obviously TikTok as the biggest app at the moment, fastest growing app at the moment, and CTV, you know, they're not based on cookies at all. You know, they are in the app ecosystem, and that really kind of highlights that fact, as I said, that the difference really was always web against app rather than desktop and mobile. And, you know, I've been in the mobile industry now for sort of 8-9 years. And the amount of times that, you know, I was talking with clients and talking about kind of their mobile strategy, how much they were spending on mobile as opposed to desktop. when really the conversation that I think needs to happen is you know, what are we spending in app against web? How are we dealing with identity in app versus web? And certainly, you know, having an app strategy rather than just a mobile strategy is very important. And that's because, you know, the web and app are fundamentally different. So this is actually from the great kickoff presentation for Project Reart from the IAB Tech Lab. Definitely, you know, go onto the website and look through the entire thing. It's a very, very thorough and well thought out presentation. I've lifted this slide off of it just to sort of show the core structure of the web, and the fact that fundamentally the web was designed to be an open architecture. You know, it was designed in 1991, you know, for everyone to be able to come together and work together. And you know, simply put, in the app ecosystem, that's just not true, right? The app ecosystem was invented by one company in 2008. You know, if you're comparing technologies between 1991 and 2008, obviously there's, you know, it's a lot more modern. And actually, the App Store launched from Apple, 552 apps in the original App Store. If you're doing any online quizzes, that's a free question for you. And 135 of those originally were free, you know, showing that freemium advertising-based kind of role of apps has always been there. You know, Google have followed, obviously with the Android and Google Play, and now certainly in Asia, there's a lot of other competition around that apps. But it's the fact that, you know, the app ecosystem is designed to have people intentionally engage with apps, download the apps, have them on their phone, rather than the open web, which is obviously much more of a search and discovery type of place. And I think that difference is very important when you're thinking about identity. The fact that people will actually share and have an intent to share their identity, rather than just kind of, you know, clicking a consent pop-up or anything like that. The fact is that if you look at the top app charts, only 9 of them at the moment don't actually require a login. So, you know, we are giving away our identity as customers to these apps because they bring utility, and because they use they bring you know, both services and, you know, actually being able to do things for you, making your life easier, making your life better. And I think that's, you know, that's where for me that difference between web and app, again, you know, if I put in my email address onto a web page, basically it just means I'm going to get spammed for the rest of my life. And that as a customer, as a consumer, is kind of where my mind's at. Whereas with apps, I would gladly give my identity away because I know that value exchange is there. And actually, you know, I checked on my phone, and out of the top 15 apps that I use, 12 of them are you know, where you log in. I give that identity, whether it's name, email address, phone number, in order to be able to improve my user experience. Which is really where, you know, for companies, you know, not having an app strategy now is you know, pretty unforgivable. You know, the fact that your customer base inside your app is going to have an intention to communicate with you. It's going to they're going to be much more engaged than on websites. They're much stickier. You speak to anyone who has a web and an app, and they'll always say that their app are for their customers who will monetize better, who will spend more money with them. And that's really because the app is that closest touch point. That's not to say, you know, as it was sort of 7-8 years ago, everyone just needs an app, and, you know, just have an app and that's all you need to do. Obviously, you need to make sure that app is actually providing value and it is having that user experience and that value exchange between yourself as a business and your customers. But once you have that, then you have a very you know, clear intent to actually be able to have an identity of your customers, which is obviously in this time, you know, definitely agree on the point from Amit about building up first party identity, both from a publisher and a business point of view. You know, you need to have those that first party data in order to be able to serve your customers. So to speak specifically about the identifiers on Apple and Google, probably, you know, what you would have imagined that I would have been speaking about from the start. On Apple iOS, it's the IDFA, the Identifier for Advertisers, and on Google and Android, it's the Google Play Store Advertising ID. And it's, you know, it's very important that in those abbreviations, the word advertiser is in there, right? These are advertiser IDs as opposed to device IDs. You know, these are resettable IDs that both Apple and Google have created in order to aid the advertising within the app ecosystem. And, you know, because of that and the power that Apple and Google have over the ecosystem, and they can continually evolve them. So we saw in Apple, the limit ad tracking settings come in, which essentially allows someone to say, you know, you can't use my identity. I don't want to be tracked at all. And it gives power back to the user. So that balance between privacy and utility from identifiers is balanced. And I think really for me that's an important point. I know that there's a lot of press that will talk about that the IDFA or the Google Ad ID will go the same way as the cookie. To be honest, you know, that's kind of already happened. That the journey for apps as far as identity and that move to privacy has shifted kind of a long time ago. And almost the more apt comparison between cookies and a mobile app identifier is probably the UDID. You know, this is a device ID that is specific to your phone. There's no way of changing it. It just sits there, and Apple actually banned anyone being able to use that in 2012. So, you know, that's already 8 years old, where already Apple and then Google were already thinking about how to make sure that privacy was front of mind. That evolution is ongoing. You know, I think you will always see Apple, especially probably take the lead, making that more and more secure, changing the way that the IDFA can be used. How long even maybe it exists without being changed. But I think it's always going to be an evolution rather than simply cutting it, because they do essentially have control over the uses of it. It's not going to get away from them as realistically cookies have gone far away from what they were designed to do to begin with. So to kind of talk about how identity then is used within app, I think it really breaks down into targeting, effectiveness, and experience. You know, for experience, whether it be being able to start watching Netflix on your phone and then being able to just watch it on your connected TV straight away, through to Roku now actually allowing you to control the box just with your phone, so you never have to have a remote control again. You know, this is ways of getting different technologies to speak to each other, which obviously has to come through from an identity. You know, there are dozens and dozens of examples of where this happens, you know, from Sonos even to the Internet of Things, and your phone becomes very much the central part of that, and obviously all of them are operating on a single ID. And then through to way brands are very much you know, using identity in order to make their customer management much more loyal and you know, much more effective. So Starbucks is the great example, where if you're walking outside one of their stores, they will send you a discount for, you know, your most favorite drink, you know, the coffee that you get. They will send you a discount in order to entice you in, where you can also pay then you know, straight from the app. So it's a seamless customer experience. And that's very strong, and you know, that realistically is part of the utility of apps, is that identity is so foundational to them and improves them so much. Again, it's difficult to see why that would be taken away when that balance between utility and privacy can be safeguarded. And then probably what all of us think about when we think about identity more in the kind of targeting landscape. And you know, the tracking in app from a wider industry perspective has always been sort of slightly behind, I think, where the industry wanted it to be. It's been much more based on usage rather than demographics. I think that's held up brand investment in app So the campaigns have much more been, based on other apps, obviously in-store ads, and much more focused on kind of, interest-based advertising, rather than having, a slew of identifiers that say 25 plus males. And I think that's been a very conscious effort, I think, by certainly Apple, because they don't like profiling. They don't like companies having a whole bunch of identifiers that they can use, because they don't see the utility in it. They don't see that value exchange. You can even see that with Apple's new sign-in process, where now, instead of using your Google ID or your Facebook ID, Apple will actually have their own sign-in process that will give each app an individual identifier to recognize that user, but that will be completely separate per app. So there won't be anyone who will be able to use that sign-in information to use kind of profiling across apps. And that's also the way that apps just generally have been designed. It's been fairly recently that people who even have demographic information inside their apps have started actually sharing that information, because you have to have an SDK inside the app. It's a completely separate kind of software, rather than obviously cookies living in the browser. But when you do have that first party data, as I was saying, that's actually becomes really, really important to be able to use it, because you do kind of have that intent and that consent, that explicit consent from your customer base to actually use that first party data. And certainly that's where retargeting in the last year and a half in app has become very strong. So people who are using your app, or who have used and then churned from your app, being able to actually use that first party data you have, again, match it with publisher first party data, social network first party data, to be able to use it effectively. And you can certainly see that as an example within the e-commerce side of things. So 3/4 of all attributions for e-commerce actually happen actually what we would term re-attribution. So that is someone being retargeted and coming into the app for a second time, downloading the app for a second time. And in e-commerce especially, because generally you see an app being downloaded, you'll see a purchase in sort of day 1, day 2 of the app being installed on the device, and then you'll see an uninstall on kind of day 4, day 5. So that kind of usage of apps now, where people are installing, doing something, and then uninstalling, obviously increasing as well, with Apple actually deleting any apps from your phone if you haven't used them for I think over about a month to 6 weeks. It kind of shows that user behavior is changing, but as long as you've got that first party data, that retargeting becomes really strong. But also, that is essentially how the advertising IDs are used for the app world, right? It is attribution, and it is actually being able to initially track where installs were coming from, and now obviously look much deeper and be able to find out lifetime value and return on ad spend. And it's a direct marketing landscape because of that identifier, and because of that ability to actually attribute your campaigns, your creative, to the actions that someone takes inside the app. And direct marketing is allowed as a legitimate interest in GDPR. It explicitly says the processing of personal data for direct marketing purposes may be regarded as carried out for legitimate interest. Now, obviously, I'm not going to get into an argument with anyone about what GDPR actually means or what it doesn't mean, but it isn't just a blanket of advertising is bad. We don't want it. As long as the data that you're using is being respectful, and that you're using it as a first party data even, then I think that that space to have attribution, again, is why it wouldn't make sense for the IDFA or for Google to simply just have no advertising identifier. Definitely an evolution will continue, but to simply get rid of it, to be honest with you, it just wouldn't make sense, really. In an $80 billion industry, it would be hard to see what the incentive was to actually lose them, when privacy can be safeguarded and can actually be used in a respectful manner, and with that control from a very centralized point of view, and the two companies, the balance between and the value exchange between the tracking and the ability to have that attribution and those identifiers and the utility that it drives for people, I think is very important to remember. And that's certainly true. If we see if we look to the future and the growth of these super apps that are dominating China and India and other parts of Asia, this is an app simply that almost becomes the new operating system. So users in China will have WeChat. That is where they will do all of their banking. That's where they will send money to their friends. It's where they will order their taxis. It's also where they will order their food. It's all of the communication, and they dominate the everyday usage. And obviously with those super apps, identity is absolutely key, but you have to have that in order to actually have that relationship with the app. So just as a conclusion then, identity is fundamentally different in app, and it's very important to remember that. It's both broader and more controlled, I would say, because it is centralized. Your app as a business is a great way to actually have that relationship with your customers and to be able to have first-party data that is actionable, and that the identity within app will continue to evolve, I'm sure, but with the positives far outweighing any negatives at the moment for advertisers and customers alike. I think it will definitely be an evolution rather than anything else. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was brilliant. And I think also summarises our event for today so nicely, given that we started talking about all the changes to cookies and cookieless world, and kind of transition on very nicely to environments that are growing that don't rely on cookies. Just a really good topic to end with. So thank you so much, and thank you to all our speakers today. We had scheduled some time for Q&A now. I am very conscious that we've overrun, and it's a beautiful day, and I'd like to allow all of you to be able to enjoy at least some of it. So I will actually just take a moment to say thank you all for joining us for this event. There is, of course, part 2 on Tuesday, so please do join us. Thank you very much to all our speakers and all the fantastic content that's been covered today. Upon leaving, or also just in the chat, there is a feedback survey form. If I could please ask you to fill it out, that's always really appreciated. We take time to read every single comment that we receive and help us to deliver great events like this one. So please do fill that out. And once again, thank you to all of you for attending. Thank you to OneTrust for sponsoring, and to all our speakers for taking their time to talk to us today.